Today we're going to show you how to troubleshoot your amp. In the event that you think you've got a bad tube, we'll go over how to determine which tube is bad and in which section, the power or the preamp section. Before we begin, we need to go over a few safety precautions. When dealing with the tube amps, you may need to expose some of the amp circuit in order to get to the tubes. At any given time, a point of contact in the circuit could be holding a high amount of voltage. It is recommended that you unplug the amp and let it sit for at least 15 minutes to allow any charged components to discharge. It is also recommended that you wear some sort of rubber glove for extra protection. Please be sure to have the amplifier turned off and unplugged when touching anything inside the amp. While it is normal to hear noise coming from your tube amp due to analog circuitry and just the nature of amps, you might hear crackling sound like popcorn or what may sound like feedback or microphonics. If this occurs, you've likely got a bad tube. If you're hearing microphonics, you can isolate the tube by gently tapping on it with the amp on. If it rings when you tap on it, that's a bad tube. To isolate a crackle or pop, you'll mostly have to find it by trial and error by swapping out tubes. Try turning the volume up and down. If it changes the volume of the noise you're hearing, then the problem lies in the preamp tubes. If not, it's a power tube. If you happen to have multiple channels on the amp, does the problem happen only on one channel? If so, it's going to be a preamp tube. Knowing which channel makes the noise can also help narrow down which preamp tube is causing the problem. Refer to your manual for more information on which tubes are for which channel. These symptoms can also be caused by the reverb tube. You can check the reverb by turning the reverb all the way off. If the noise goes away, the reverb tube is bad. Refer to your manual to see which tube governs the reverb. Once you've identified a problem tube, you can replace it. When removing preamp tubes, be mindful of the direction they are facing when taken out. They must go back in the exact same way they came out. Otherwise, you may damage the tube or the tube socket. Power tubes have a guide on the bottom that must be correctly inserted into the tube socket. Make sure the guide is lined up with the groove in the tube socket. Preamp tubes can be replaced one at a time, but be sure to replace it with the same type of tube. Power tubes must be replaced in matched sets. If you have a bad power tube, replace them all. Again, make sure the power is off and the amp is unplugged when touching anything inside the amp. If you're not getting any signal from your amplifier, there are a few things you can do to isolate the problem. If the amplifier does power on, first, check to see if your amp has an HT fuse on the back panel. When the HT fuse blows, the power will come on, but the speaker will be completely silent without the typical background hum or hiss noise. If this fuse is bad, replace it. If it continues to blow, you've likely got a bad power or rectifier tube. If the HT fuse is fine and your amp has an effects loop, try plugging your guitar into the return jack. This will bypass the preamp section and take you straight to the power amp. If you get signal, and the signal will be weak, then you know that the preamp is where the problem lies. If you do not get signal, your problem is likely a power tube. If you've determined that the problem lies in the preamp section and you have extra tubes, try swapping a good tube for one of the tubes in your amp until you get signal. Just make sure it's the same model. Make sure that the power is turned off during any tube replacement. If the amp does not power on, you've likely blown the main power fuse. You can usually find these on the back of your amp. When a main power fuse blows, it's very likely that you've got a bad power or rectifier tube. To verify this, remove all the power and rectifier tubes by gently wiggling and pulling them out, and replacing the fuses. Next, turn the amp on. If it stays on, then the main fuse is good, but you have a bad tube. If the main fuse still blows, you've got a bigger problem and you need to send your amp in for service. If it's a power or rectifier tube that's bad, we need to isolate it. To do this, insert the rectifier tube, if your amp has them, one at a time with the power off. Be careful to align the groove in the tube socket with the guide on the bottom of the tube. After inserting each tube, turn the power on, then right back off. If you see a flash of light from the tube, it's bad. If not, turn the power back on and leave it on. If the amp remains on, this tube is fine and you can continue with any remaining rectifier tubes. Once you verify that your rectifier tube or tubes are okay, it's likely that your power tube is causing the problem. While rectifier tubes can be replaced one at a time, power tubes must be replaced in matched pairs. Because of this, you should replace all the power tubes at once to avoid damaging both your tubes and your amplifier. As long as you use the same model power tube with the same rating, you shouldn't need to rebias the amp. If you end up changing the type of tube, you'll need to have the amp rebiased by a trained amp technician. If after replacing all the power tubes you're still blowing the fuse on your amp, there is an internal problem with the amp and it will need to come in for service.